we studying? Mark. Very good. So open up to Mark. Open up to Mark. Now, besides Elsie, does anyone else not have email? You have email. Okay. So, you have no excuse now except for Elsie. Unless you're out of service, that's right. Because one of our elders who takes care of sending out the announcements on Saturday nights and everything also includes the question slide from Sunday. So you always have the questions available now. All right? And did we have questions from last week? Yes, we did. Yes, we did. All right. And you had an assignment for last week, too, a reading assignment. All right. So, we are in Mark chapter 1. And let's just talk about that real quick. You were supposed to read chapter 1 before you came to class. Tracy, hit that middle light, would you please? So, what did anything stand out to you when you read Mark chapter 1? Rebecca. Mark's gospel account begins in a completely different way than any of the other gospel accounts, right? Matthew's going to begin with a genealogy. Luke is going to begin with the birth narrative, including the narrative of the birth of John the Baptist. Okay? John is even going to take us all the way back to the beginning of the world and before. Where's Mark begin? John the Baptist preaching and Jesus being baptized. All right, so a completely different starting point. What else, when you were reading Mark, jumped out to you? The word straightway, if you're reading in the King James Version, Julia, correct? Yes. Yep. And if you're reading from a newer translation, it's not straightway, it's immediately. That's right. The word straightway or immediately. Let's see here. You've got verse 10, verse 12, verse 18, verse 20, verse 21, verse 23, verse 28, verse 29, verse 30, verse 42, verse 43, and if you happen to be reading from the Greek, verse 3. So, I didn't count how many times that was, but what's a favorite word of Mark? Immediately. We'll talk about that here in a second. Anything else from Mark 1 that stood out to you? Jeff?
Two things. Verse 41, Jesus was moved with compassion.
Jesus is moved with compassion.
And in verse 30, you get Peter's wife mentioned once, and then she's mentioned later when Paul says, "Don't I have the ability to lead about a life like
just like you do?"
the others?"
Yep. So we've got a mention here of Peter's wife. That's going to become important, especially in light of modern Catholic teachings. All right. Anything else in Mark 1 stood out to you? Rebecca? Action. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Action. Good point. Anyone else? Any deep insights and pearls of wisdom? All right, so these were our questions from last week, right? We're starting to answer them already. All right. So what word does Mark use frequently throughout his account? Immediately. That's right, immediately. Okay? Here's an interesting comparison. You're going to find the term, that Greek word, which is, if you're interested, it's the Greek word euthus. Euthus. It is used 40 times approximately in the book of Mark. Most always it's translated immediately or straightway, depending on the translation you're reading from. A few times it's going to be translated straight, and that's what it is in chapter 1 and verse 3. Make his paths straight. Okay? Used approximately 40 times in Mark. And Matthew, how many chapters is Matthew?
26.
A little bit more? A little bit more? 28, that's right. 28 chapters, the word is used 8 times. In Luke is going to be 24 chapters, right? 1 time. And in John, you've got it used 3 times, all right? So, is this going to be an important word? Okay. So what would Mark's usage of that word communicate about his gospel account? Urgency. What else? Action, right? This is a gospel of action and movement. When we were talking about this, Aaron can vouch in the high school class, someone called it, this is kind of the ADHD gospel, right? This is not John laying out logical argumentation. This is not Luke setting about to create an ordered account. This is Mark looking at what? Things and situations that are happening, right? Did you ever watch the Disney movie Up, or the Pixar movie Up? Right? Tie the balloons to the house goes flying up. One of the funny characters in the movie is a dog. What does the dog always do? Squirrel. Squirrel. Jerks his head. It's kind of what you see with Mark's gospel account. We're always looking at movement. We're always looking at action. Okay? That's going to play an important role in Mark's gospel account. All right? And we're going to develop that theme maybe a little bit this morning. Okay, question number 3 is my fault because I was not very clear with question number 3. When is Jerusalem first mentioned in Mark's gospel account? Okay, verse 5. And that's my fault because I didn't make this very clear. Verse 5 is the first time that Jerusalem is mentioned. What I meant to say is, where is Jesus mentioned in Jerusalem for the first time in Mark's gospel account? And that's where this gets interesting. That's right. Did you kind of read into what I was meaning? That's great.
I had to read it. I went back and read it twice, and I thought,
You guys have been with me for too long that you're now able to read my mind. That's scary, right? So Mark chapter 1 and verse 5, Jeff is correct. Jerusalem is first mentioned there, but I want you to come over to Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10. And I did not catch this until I started this study 2 weeks ago. Chapter 10 and verse 32, and they were on the road, Jesus and the apostles, going up to Jerusalem. This is the first time in Mark's gospel account that he's going to record Jesus going to Jerusalem. All the other accounts, this has already happened, right? Is it John chapter 2? We've got the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee. Then what does Jesus do immediately after that in John's account? He cleanses the temple. Well, where's the temple? Jerusalem, right? Matthew, we're there in Jerusalem early on. Luke, we're there early on where he's taking the scroll. And well, no, that's not Jerusalem. But you're seeing Jerusalem early on there in Luke as well. That's when they're coming to the temple to pay the redemption price of the firstborn child. Mark, we don't have Jesus in Jerusalem until going to Jerusalem until chapter 10. And that then leads into the next question. When is the temple first mentioned in Mark's gospel account? Chapter 11. Chapter 11, look at verse 11. Chapter 11, verse 11. He entered Jerusalem and came into the temple. And after looking all around, he departed for Bethany with the 12, since it was already late. So the first time that he's going to enter Jerusalem, what's he going to do? Does Mark record? Goes into the temple and does what? Yeah, second day he's going to cleanse the temple. The first day, he just goes in and walks around and then does what? And then leaves. And then, well, you may remember this from years and years and years ago, when we had a study about the last week of the life of Christ and things like that. What is he doing? What's his pattern that Mark lays out here? He's in Jerusalem and in the temple during the day, and at night, where's he going? Back out to Bethany, spending the night, then back into Jerusalem, and he's making this trip kind of back and forth between day and night, day and night. But this is the first time that we've got the temple mentioned in Mark's gospel account. Now, let's just take those two things. What might the answers to questions 3 and 4 reveal to us about Mark's gospel account? We don't get to Jerusalem until chapter 10. We don't get into the temple until chapter 11. So that's more than half of Mark's gospel account that's taking place where? Away from Jerusalem and away from the temple. So what might that tell us? Maybe Mark wasn't from Jerusalem.
He wasn't a Jew.
Perhaps he wasn't a Jew, although I think he was. Jeff?
Kind of emphasized that people out in the country were more receptive to
Okay.
it than people in the big city where they had so much of the hierarchy.
That's a possibility. It's not the one I'm thinking of, but it is a possibility. Rebecca?
Possibly he's de-emphasizing the old law and becoming Christ and the new law.
Okay, let's dig into that a little bit. What purpose would it serve if you're not making an emphasis of the old law? Could be that it's changing. But think back to last week, and I'm not disagreeing with you. Think back to last week. We talked about 2 persecutions, right? Around 60, AD 60, and around AD 40. Where did both of those take place? Not Jerusalem. Where?
Rome.
Rome. Okay? Now take that.
The Roman army in Jerusalem.
Well, the Roman army was stationed in Jerusalem. They have the fortress Antonia that is right there above the temple compound. Think with me here for a moment. Notice something else. See if I can draw this out a little bit more. We don't enter the temple until chapter 11. We don't enter Jerusalem until chapter 10. What people cared a lot about the temple in Jerusalem? Jews. Mark goes 10 chapters without even mentioning those. So who's his audience? Gentiles. Is Mark writing a gospel account that is appealing to a Jewish mind? Not at all. Think about this as well. Rebecca brought this out earlier. How did Matthew begin his gospel account? With a lineage. Shortly after chapter 1 in Luke's gospel account, what do you get? A lineage. What does Mark not give us? Why? For his purpose, it's not important. Now, is Jesus' lineage important? Yes, but to Mark's purpose is it important? No, it's not. Let's develop that a little bit more, okay? So Mark's account, this is what I'm submitting to you, isn't primarily oriented towards a Jewish audience. Let me demonstrate that to you. Sometimes we talk about an intended audience, right? And even I have said that before, and I don't like it. I don't like calling a book, an epistle, and saying it's intended audience. And I'm trying to get myself out of that. So I caught myself here and marched through it, right? Because there is an original audience. Mark had an original audience. Paul, writing to the Ephesians, the Colossians, the Thessalonians, had an original audience. But they all intended their work to be preserved and passed down, right? And so, yes, while the Thessalonians or the Ephesians or the Colossians may have been an intended audience, who else is an intended audience? Us, everyone, exactly, okay? So I marked through that. Let's call it Mark's original audience, okay? As we're trying to dive through and identify Mark's original audience here, let's start with this. Matthew's audience seems to be a Jewish audience, Okay? How do we know that?
The way it's structured.
Okay? Let me give you a hint. Open up to Matthew. Look at Matthew chapter 1. Open up to Matthew and tell me how. We're pretty certain Matthew's gospel is for a Jewish audience. Okay, a genealogy.
But it only goes to Abraham.
A genealogy that goes back to Abraham, right? And focuses on what two people? Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Who cares about David and Abraham? The Jews. Does a Gentile living off in Thessalonica, Ephesus, or Rome really give two flips about Abraham or David? Not really. Not really. But who would care? A Jew would. Because what's coming through Abraham? The seed. What's significant about David? The throne. The throne of David, right? Okay. So that's why it's generally accepted that Matthew's audience are Jews. Luke's gospel account is going to be just a little bit different. Look at Luke real quick. We're getting away for a moment, but that's okay. Is Luke's original audience going to be Jews? What's the answer, Aaron? No, it's not. Very good. I can tell you've been studying, right? The answer is no. Luke's audience is not a Jewish audience. Luke's is a Gentile audience. And that makes sense because what was Luke? He himself is a Gentile, right? A Gentile physician, or at least that seems to be correct. Look at the lineage he gives over in chapter 3. Chapter 3 and verse 23, when he began his ministry, Jesus himself was about 30 years of age, and supposedly the son of Joseph, the son of Eli, the son of Matthat, the son of Levi, the son of Melchi, the son of Jannai, the son of Joseph. And we're going all the way down, and who do we arrive at in verse 34? In verse 34. Abraham, okay? Which is where who stopped? Matthew stops at Abraham. Where does Luke go? And this is verse 38 now. Adam. Why would Luke's lineage take him all the way back to Adam? That's all of us. Not just the Jews who come from Abraham. This is everybody. Right, okay? So, let me submit to you that Mark's audience doesn't seem to be primarily Jewish, right? Jerusalem and the temple are not major figures, right? We don't get into Jerusalem until chapter 11, and that's when we get to the temple as well in Mark. How about this? If you have read ahead, there are relatively few Old Testament quotations in Mark. Okay? Matthew has quite a few. Luke, just because of how long it is going to have some. Mark doesn't have a lot, especially before chapter 10. Now, here's a thought. Why would Mark start to have more Old Testament quotations in chapter 11 and onward? Because he's in the temple. Who's he around them? He's around Jews, and so he's going to reason with them from what? He's going to record Jesus conversing with them about the law of Moses. But before that point, we're not dealing with... Mark's not presenting Jesus as the Jewish answer, right? And so, there's not a lot of focus on the Old Testament. I want you to look at these. These are going to be our Old Testament quotations before chapter 11. Verses 2 and 3 in chapter 1, and we're going to look at that later. Come over to chapter 4. Chapter 4 and verse 12. While seeing they may see and not perceive, and while hearing they may hear and not understand, lest they return again and be forgiven. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record, I believe that's a quotation from Isaiah, right? Isaiah chapter 6. And that throughout the Gospels is attached with Jesus beginning to teach the people in what? In parables. That's right, in parables. Okay? You come over to chapter 7. Chapter 7. So we've got chapter 1, skip a few chapters. Chapter 4, skip a few chapters. Chapter 7. Chapter 7 and verse 6. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching his precepts or doctrine, the commandments of men. That's another quotation from where? Isaiah. Whoa. Chapter 7 is a quotation from Isaiah, thank you. Chapter 4, it's a quotation from Isaiah. Chapter 1, it's a quotation from Isaiah. Let's identify something else about our audience now. While they are Gentiles, are they Gentiles who just have no conceptualization whatsoever about what happened in history, what happened in the past, even what was written down in Jewish law? What book do they seem to be familiar with? Isaiah. Isaiah. Okay. Ethiopian eunuch was reading from Isaiah as well. Very good. Chapter 8. Chapter 8 and verse 18. Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? That can be a reference to Isaiah, or it can be a quotation from, I think your Bible might have a note there of Ezekiel, right? And then look at chapter 10. Chapter 10. From the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this cause, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. Consequently, they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. Of course, that's a quotation from where? From Genesis. That's right. And then verse 19. Verse 19. You know the commandments. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother, which are quotations from where? Exodus and Deuteronomy, that's right. And who is speaking to him there in verse 17 that might explain this? Good teacher, right, thought to be a scribe. Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And of course, we gather that he might be a scribe from reading parallel accounts of this and other gospel accounts, all right? But up to chapter 11, that's the entirety of the Old Testament quotations that we find in Mark. Primarily quoting from Isaiah, right? A lot of Old Testament quotations in Mark? No. Which would fit him speaking to what kind of an audience? Gentile audience, that's right. Jeff?
I hope you weren't going to bring this up, but since we're thinking of Mark as kind of Velcro to Peter,
Uh-huh.
since Peter is the one who was sent to preach first to the Gentiles when he went to Cornelius, and was known to pal around with Gentiles unless the Judaizing teachers came,
There may be a connection.
then I think Mark probably had to do a lot of, I mean, if they were together a lot,
Mhm.
he would have had to do a lot of explaining backstories to these people.
Perhaps
Because
so.
they don't know anything about all this stuff. And Mark wants them to have faith in Jesus
Yeah.
and the whole law.
So, I agree with most of that. I'm going to present just a little twist on that. I don't think we should view these Gentiles as just kind of, and I'm not saying you characterize this as this, as just these kind of buffoons to the law of Moses.
Well, I don't mean that.
I
I
know.
just mean that they've never studied.
They're not as well versed in it as a Jew would be, but I think they have had exposure to it. And I think we can demonstrate a little bit about that. But Jeff, your point is well taken. I think you're right. I think that connection with Peter is interesting as you begin to map all of this out. Of course, we noted what happens to alter this pattern. Jesus and his apostles make their way into Jerusalem. If his original audience aren't Jews, then who are they? Gentiles. But then, what would explain the persecution that we discussed last week? If his original audience are Gentiles, what explains the persecution and suffering that kind of forms a backdrop to Mark's gospel account? Well, how did the Romans view Christianity originally? Sect of Judaism. So if you're going to be persecuting the Jews, more often than not, you're also going to be persecuting whom? Christians. Okay? Christians. Now, could a Gentile, and I don't mean for this to sound in your face, but it's a necessary point. Could a Gentile Christian demonstrate that he was not a Jew? Okay, and I'll let you figure that out on your own, make those connections. Yes. And so, when all the Jews are kicked out of Rome, would necessarily all the Gentile Christians be kicked out of Rome? No, because some of them could display that they were what? Gentiles and not Jews. Okay? So you would have some who would remain there in Rome. I would submit to you that Mark's original audience are Gentile converts to Christianity who are in the area of Rome. Well, how in the world does the gospel get to Rome? If these are Gentile converts to Christianity living in Rome, how in the world did the gospel get to these Gentiles who then come to Christ?
Acts chapter 8, they were scattered and whenever.
Okay. In Acts chapter 8 and verse 4, you have the persecution that arises after Stephen's death, and those who were scattered, chapter 8 and verse 4, went everywhere preaching the word. Okay?
Acts 2, it says strangers from Rome.
There you go. Go even further back than Acts 8. Go to Acts chapter 2. And Jeff, this is where I begin to make this sort of connection with these Gentile Christians having a familiarity with some of the Old Testament. Because if we map it out from what we see in the book of Acts, how does the gospel get to Rome? It's going to get to Rome through Jewish people who have become what? Christians and have returned to Rome. Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2 and verse 5. Yes, 10 is where we're going, Tracy. There were Jews living in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven. And when this sound occurred, the multitude came together and were bewildered because they were each one hearing them speak in his own language. And they began to be amazed and to marvel, saying, "Why are not all these who speak Galileans? How is it that we each hear them in our own language to which we were born? Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the districts of Libya around Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them in our own tongue speaking the mighty deeds of God." So, if we just look at this in a practical way, here's the day of Pentecost, one of the 3 Jewish feast days where you had to return back to Jerusalem. On the day of Pentecost, you have the happenings with the apostles, the divided tongues of fire above the head, the preaching of the gospel, and we've got people who are responding from every nation under heaven, including citizens of Rome. You going to live in Jerusalem? No, eventually you're going to do what? Eventually you're going to go home. But what are you taking with you? You're taking the gospel with you. Now you're a Jew. You're familiar with the law of Moses, right? But when you go back and you're teaching Jesus, is that strictly for the Jews? Well, it was to the Jews first. But shortly thereafter in the book of Acts, it's for whom? For everybody. But if your introduction into Christianity came from a Jew, then what you learned about Christianity was probably rooted where? The Old Testament. And as we have seen in Acts chapter 8 and other places, what's a really easy Old Testament book to go to talk about Christ? Isaiah. And so Mark 1, Mark 4, Mark 7, Mark records Jesus quoting from Isaiah. You see how the pieces kind of fit together here. Clint.
Going back even before Pentecost, if they were there at Pentecost, there's a good chance they were there at Passover too, so they could have been around.
And seen everything that happened, right? Do you think, here, let's run down. What happens, what Clint said, if they're there at Pentecost, there was a good chance they were there 50 days before at Passover. Right? That's when Jesus is crucified. List off to me what happens audibly, visibly, in connection with Jesus being crucified. Veil of the temple is torn. Darkness for 3 hours. Earthquake. Yeah, bodies of some of the saints arise and start walking through the city. Is that going to have an impact on people? I mean, seriously. You're here for Passover. You know, we're killing the lamb, we're putting the blood, you know, all of that stuff. We're remembering the Exodus from Egypt. And then all of a sudden, Josiah and Hoshea, you know, who died 4 weeks ago, do what? They just come walking out of the tomb and walking around the city. Is that going to make an impact on us? Absolutely. And now we're back in Jerusalem 50 days later for Pentecost, and we've got divided tongues of fire on these guys' heads, and these guys are preaching to Jesus who was crucified. When all of these bodies came up, when darkness was on the face of the earth, earthquakes, all of that, is this meaningful? Is this impactful? Is this saying, hey, might better be listening to these guys? So there's this way that it's all fitting together. So Mark's original audience seems to be Gentile converts to Christianity in Rome. I want you to look at the end of Mark's account. We're almost done here this morning. Look at Mark chapter 15. And Clint, I'm going to have you go over to Romans 16 and verse 13. Clint, go to Romans 16 and verse 13. I'm going to read from Mark 15 and verse 21. Here's what Mark writes. Mark chapter 15 and verse 21 concerning the procession to the crucifixion of Jesus. They pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, that he might bear the cross. So it's the father of Alexander and Rufus that's going to carry the cross of Jesus out to Calvary, right? Now, Clint, Romans chapter 16 and verse 13.
Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine.
So Paul writes to the Romans and says to them, I want you to give my greetings to Rufus. Now, here's just a quick, just little quip that Mark inserts here. But if we have correctly identified that his audience is a Gentile audience, most probably individuals in Rome, does a quick and passing reference to Rufus make sense, especially in light of Romans 16, where who apparently is there as a Christian in Rome? Rufus. You see, there are these little bits and pieces that all fit together that give us this picture. Mark is writing to a Gentile audience. And so I want you to think about how is Mark's gospel account adapted for that audience? How is Mark's gospel account adapted for a Gentile audience? If you were writing back in the first century and you were writing not to Jews but to Gentiles, how would you write differently?
The miracles are going to be more impressive.
Okay, number one, you're going to write a lot about miracles and things that were done, right? Okay? We're getting to that in just a second. That's not the first one on my list, but it is on my list. All right? You're not going to be quoting from where? You're not going to be doing a lot of quotation from Exodus or Obadiah or something like that, right? He doesn't demonstrate Jesus as the Messiah through fulfilled Old Testament prophecy. Who would have been intimately familiar with the Old Testament prophecies concerning the Messiah? The Jews were, but we're not writing to Jews, we're writing to Gentiles, right? Okay? He's going to, as Glenn said, demonstrate Jesus as the Messiah through his action. And so Mark is going to write, immediately Jesus did this, and immediately Jesus did that, and straightway he did this. And miracle after miracle after miracle, right? The New Testament records nearly approximately, just stressing to you that it's up in the air, approximately 40 miracles of Jesus. And there's only one miracle of Jesus that is recorded in all four gospel accounts, and that's the feeding of the 5,000. Okay? Mark records approximately 20 miracles. Matthew and Luke are going to record the same. John is going to record 7. But Mark records 20 miracles in the span of how many chapters? 16. Verses 28 for Matthew and 24 for Luke. Mark's gospel account clocks in as the shortest at somewhere around 660 verses. So 660 verses, 20 miracles. There is a good deal of Mark's gospel account that is given over to what? To what Jesus did. And to the miracles that are being performed. So, as a practical exercise, which I thought we might have more time for this morning, but we do not. Jesus' first miracle in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, well, Jesus' first miracle in Mark happens in chapter 1, right? Doesn't happen in Matthew until after chapter 3. Doesn't happen in Luke until after chapter 3. But in Mark, it happens in chapter 1. And then, this is where I want us to get to, and we can wrap up here. Where's the genealogy in Mark? Where's Mark's genealogy account? Dan, where's the genealogy in the book of Mark? It is? In Mark? There's not one. Dan, it was kind of a trick question. No, it's fine. There's no genealogy in Mark's gospel account, is there? Dan, I thought we were on the same wavelength. Sorry.
Father, if there's one thing I noticed just flipping through here.
Yes.
Got one of those red letter Bibles.
Yes.
This is like somebody let the blood bank out. It's proper.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus talks a lot in this.
Yeah.
I guess he's trying to get the people to know what he is, who he is.
He talks a lot, but it's not going to be the long monologues like we have in Matthew and Luke. There's no 3-chapter monologue Sermon on the Mount in Mark. There's no, chapter-long Sermon on the Plain. Mark records a lot of Jesus teaching, but it's not going to be in that long monologue form. Where's the genealogy? It's not there. Daniel B. Wallace, who was a New Testament scholar, says this in his introduction to Mark. I love this quote. There is no genealogy for the credentials of a servant or his actions. Jesus is the servant in Mark's gospel account. Matthew pictures him as the king, but Mark pictures him as a servant. Is a servant's genealogy important? No, he's a servant, but what's important about a servant? His actions, what he does. And what does Mark record? What Jesus does. What Jesus does. All right, so here's your questions for next week. Okay? And you don't even have to write these down anymore, do you? You can if you want to, or take a picture. Questions for October 4. What is different about Mark's introduction of Jesus in chapter 1 and verse 1? We've already kind of touched on that already. Number 2, where does Mark quote from in 1, 2, and 3? I want you to be specific on that. Where does Mark quote from in chapter 1, verses 2 and 3? Don't take a picture yet, Gloria. I don't have all the questions up there. Come on. I'm just playing with you. Number 3, what is the first episode recorded in Mark's... That can't be. In Mark's gospel account, what's the first story that Mark records for us? Question 4, look at Matthew 4 and Luke 4. Why do you think Mark's temptation narrative is so brief? And number 5, what does Jesus reveal was at hand in Mark chapter 1 and verse 15? Those are your questions for next week. All right? Got it? Got it? Camera's down. All right. And your reading assignment, read Mark chapter 1, 1 through 15. We already read Mark chapter 1. Read the first 15 verses again. All right? Appreciate it, guys. Thanks for being here this morning.